welcome to the New York City Water Board's Upstate rate hearing for fiscal year 2016. My name is Greg Asserto. I will be the hearing officer today. Before we start the presentation and the public testimony, I have several exhibits to read into the record. The first is Exhibit 1, which is the designation of a hearing officer. The second exhibit is the public notice of this hearing. Exhibit 3 is the affidavit of publication of that notice. Exhibit 4 is a copy of the notice as it was published on the Water Board's website. Exhibit 5 is the Upstate rate report and also the transmittal letter of that report. The report is titled, Report on the Cost of Supplying Water to Upstate Customers for the 2016 rate year. And we've also received some written testimony. The first is labeled Exhibit 6A, which is a letter dated May 28th, 2015, submitted by Stephen Johnson, the Water Superintendent of the Village of Scarsdale. We've also received an email from Nanette LeBlanc, and also an email from William Maloney. And we've also today received a letter from Christopher Graziano, the Senior Director of United Water. If anyone else would like to submit written testimony, you could just hand it in to us right now, or it could be mailed or emailed to the board by 12 p.m. on Friday, June 5th, 2015. The email address is New York City Water Board at dep.nyc.gov. And the mailing address is New York City Water Board, 59-17, Junction Boulevard, 8th floor, Flushing, New York, 11373. And before we start the presentation, I'd like to introduce to my left, Mathieu McLean, who's the board's treasurer. And to her left is Steve Lawitz, the executive director. Also today we have the board's rate consultant, which is Amawalk Consulting. They're represented by Ed Marcus and Sean Lake. And the first item on the agenda is a presentation on the proposed rates for fiscal year 2016. That will be followed by a short statement from the board's rate consultant, and then we will open it up to public testimony. And, that concludes the introductory remarks.
Will that work?
Sure.
Okay, even better. Technology's on my thanks. Thank you everyone for coming. So I want to go through briefly the development of the proposed Upstate wholesale rate for the fiscal year that begins July 1st. That's fiscal year 2016. A little background on the city's water supply system. That we supply over 1 billion gallons a day to 8.5 million people in the city, or more appropriate to this meeting, approximately 1 million upstate residents. And the 1 million upstate residents collectively consume about 100 million gallons a day, about 10% of our total water consumption when you include both in-city and upstate. So we have a number of capital investments in the water supply system, and just a portion of them we're going to show here. Dam reconstruction. This is a photo of Gilboa Dam after its $200 million upgrading was completed in the fall, and it's part of a total of $450 million that we're planning for investment in our dams. There's another phase for Gilboa, and also in our 10-year capital plan, there are several projects for the Ashokan Dam and related infrastructure. Perhaps our biggest single project of the next 10 years is the program that we've been calling Water for the Future, which is to repair the leak in the Delaware Aqueduct. As I think everyone in this room knows, the Delaware Aqueduct, which carries about 50% of New York City's drinking water supply, has had a leak that we've known about for the last 20 years or so. It leaks up to 35 million gallons of water a day, which is, on the one hand, only about 3.5% of our total daily water delivery. On the other hand, 35 million gallons is 35 million gallons. It's a substantial amount of water. And this is a program that involves two major construction contracts. The first one, called BT1, is already underway. It's to construct two shafts, two vertical shafts, one on each side of the Hudson River. That contract is going very well, and we're ahead of schedule on it. And we also just submitted to the New York City Controller for registration the larger of the two main contracts on this, which we call BT2, which is to construct a 2.5-mile bypass tunnel under the Hudson River. And that is a contract that was bid at approximately $707 million. And we expect the City Controller to register the contract before the end of June, and we expect construction to start this fall. We're also doing a number of other smaller projects as part of this program, including our commissioner likes to say it's an elegant word for cleaning the inside of the Catskill Aqueduct. We call it optimization. It's to remove the biofilm that's accumulated over the years and basically restore the inside of the Catskill Aqueduct to its design flow capacity. And we also have a number of water conservation programs underway both in the city and upstate. If you look at the change in distribution over time, going back to 2001, you see a similar overall trend between in-city water consumption and upstate water consumption. But the trend is a little more pronounced in city. There's been a 17% decline in daily consumption in the city, and during the same period for the upstate communities combined, there's been a 12% decrease in the amount we deliver collectively to the upstate water utilities. But even though the trend has been...
Repeat that.
You want to go back?
Yeah, just that towards the end. Your percentages, your comparisons.
I'm sorry?
The 17, can you repeat the numbers?
Oh, sure, and it's up there too in the boxes.
Yeah.
It's little though.
That over the 2001-2014 period, in-city water distribution has declined by 14%, upstate, I'm sorry, 17%, and upstate collectively about 12%. We began to offer about a year ago, 2 years ago, time passes so quickly. We began to offer to the 10 largest upstate water utilities a program to assist them in conservation planning and implementation. And the planning is phase 1, the implementation be phase 2. And so far, 6 of those 10 largest utilities have taken us up on our offer and are participating in the consulting assistance that we're offering to help them plan to reduce their water consumption. So we'll get to the rate itself now. This slide, I think this is probably the 5th consecutive year that we've shown this slide. There are 2 parts to the Upstate rate, the entitlement rate and the excess rate. The Water Supply Act of 1905 entitles the communities in certain counties to quantities of water which currently are defined as the official population of each water district times the per capita consumption of water in New York City. Communities who consume above that amount, that increment above the entitlement amount is charged at an excess rate. The quantities consumed within the entitlement amount are are priced at the entitlement rate. And the entitlement rate is calculated just based on the cost of service. We'll get to that in a minute. And the excess rate has been set to be the same as the in-city rate for water only, not water and sewer. So as I said, this is based on the cost of service. So we determine what it costs to supply water. And that includes our personnel costs, our capital investment, but actually in order, as you'll see in a minute, it's our capital investment and it's real estate taxes, and then it's our personnel, and then a number of other costs. And for this year, for 2016, as proposed, we have a total cost of service of $669 million. And we have had in place for the last several years a reconciliation with the latest complete fiscal year. And since we still have 29 days left to go in fiscal year 2015, our most recent completed fiscal year is 2014, which ended June 30th of 2014. So we have a reconciliation which increases the cost by almost 11 million, making the total numerator in this case to be $680 million. Consumption, as we've done for many years, consumption is based on a 10-year regression analysis, and we are projecting consumption at 393 billion. 393.5 billion gallons. 393,000 million gallons. Again, that's total water consumption, both upstate and in-city. So dividing the Total cost of service, $680 million. By the projected consumption gets you a entitlement rate per 1 million gallons of $1,728.99. It's an increase of 9.87% over the current rate. We had projected last year at this time that it would be 8.5? 8.4%. As I mentioned before, when you look at that 669 million that was on the previous slide, and here's how it divides. Debt service, 44%. That's actually the same percentage that debt service represents of our total in-city costs as well. It wasn't the case only a few years ago that debt service wasn't as large. We've been investing a lot, and we've been investing a lot in the drinking water. I mean, in city we also invest a lot in wastewater treatment and stormwater capture, but upstate we've been investing a lot. Real estate taxes. I don't honestly know of any other, certainly don't know of any city agency, don't know of a utility where that would be the second highest cost, real estate taxes, but it is for us. It's higher than personnel costs. And we expect to pay $165 million in property taxes next year. This year we're paying about $160 million. And personnel costs at $114 million. And then we have filtration avoidance, and then we have all other costs which are broken out in this box on the lower right. And it's a lot of stuff: chemicals, contract operating and maintenance services, energy, Hillview, the UV facility operation, and offset a little bit by our miscellaneous revenues. So here you can see the changes in the major components of our cost last year, or this year, which is about to end, compared to next year. And most of the costs are going up, unfortunately. Again, here is just going back to the summary. A proposed rate of $1,728.99. Last year, at the bottom, we were projecting the rate to be $1,705 instead of $1,728, and that would have been, as Mattil said, close to an 8.4% increase. So the difference between last year's projection and what we're proposing now is about 1.5 percentage points. Comparing it to the in-city rate, and one way of looking at this is the entitlement rate as a percentage of the in-city charge. And so if you look at what it is this year and what it's expected to be next year, the entitlement rate is growing as a percentage of the in-city charge. It would probably make more sense if I told you that the entitlement rate is growing at the 9.87%, and in-city, the water board recently approved an increase for the next fiscal year of 2.97%. So with upstate rates growing at almost 10% and in-city rates growing at just under 3%, the entitlement rate becomes a bigger percentage of the in-city rate. And again, just to show a range from selected upstate water districts, that when you take the rates that we charge wholesale to each of the upstate water districts, and you look at what the districts charge their retail customers, you see a variation in the percentage that the entitlement rate comprises of the total retail rate that the upstate water utilities charge to their retail customers. And it generally it is inversely proportional to the size of the water district, so that I take that back, it's directly proportional. So that the larger districts like Yonkers, White Plains, where they get economies of scale, and so the cost that they have to add on for distribution, maintenance, any additional treatment are relatively, percentage-wise, smaller than the smaller districts like Carmel, where our water cost is only 18% of what the retail customer pays, and in Yonkers, it's 40%. That's the end of my presentation. Again, if anyone wants to submit testimony, you have several ways to do that by the end of the day, Friday. Greg, back to you.
Thank you, Steve. Next, we have the board's rate consultant, Amawalk Consulting. We have Sean Lynn, who has a statement for us. If you just want to pull that microphone.
Who's going to be the good host?
I'm Shannon of the Amawalk Consulting Group, and I'm here today to testify regarding a report on the cost of supplying water to upstate customers for the 2016 grade year that was prepared by Amawalk. For the record, I wish to state that the report was prepared in accordance with the methodology that was approved by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. The report illustrates a calculation of the cost of service for fiscal year 2016 and proposes a regulated rate of $1,728.99 per million gallons. The increase in charges over the current rate would be $12.43 for the entire year, or about 3 cents per day for a single-family residence using 80,000 gallons of water per year.
Thank you, Sean. Our first speaker registered tonight is Michael Blight, the town attorney of the town of New Windsor.
Do you want me to come here?
Well, so Michael, you can get closer to the microphone, that would be helpful, thanks.
First, I apologize for the phone. I thought I had it off. And we will be submitting something by the end of the week. As you know, I'm the town attorney for the town of New Windsor. And about sometime in the mid-'70s, the town of New Windsor made a decision to shut down their municipal wells and access the Catskill Aqueduct. The reasons for that largely were because it is a pure supply of water, it is a reliable supply of water, and it was originally a relatively inexpensive source of supply of water. It's still pure and it's still reliable, but it has become very expensive for the town. To give you an example, when I became the town attorney on January 1st, 2006, we were paying $617.19 per million gallons, and the excess rate was $2,205 per million gallons. Obviously, now we know that the 617, just 9.5 years later, is $1,728. The cost is becoming prohibitive. It's actually approximately 8% of our total municipal budgets. I've checked with our controller on that. And one of the problems New Windsor has is that we are consistently at the right where the town consumption crosses over to the excess rate. So as I said, it's a problem because it stifles any type of commercial development in the town. Because virtually any water user that comes on board that is commercial does not factor into the per capita rate. And any user would be we would be talking about water at over $5,000 per million gallons for delivery of water to that type of customer. As a matter of fact, I believe that Campbell's Soup was looking at some property the town owned at the airport. And we basically had to turn them down because they were a significant water consumer, and it was just not feasible to provide the water at that rate. So I'm here with John Agito, who is the principal operating engineer for the town. And we sort of kicked it around last week, and we were trying to look at what is really driving the large rate increases. And going back to the Water Act of 1905, maybe at that time it was proper for Westchester and the large communities on the east side of the Hudson to be part of the overall upstate scene. But if you look at the major projects that the Water Board has on the table, most of the capital costs are associated with construction on what I'll term as the east side of the Hudson. John identified a UV plant. I believe it's the Hillview Reservoir is going to be covered in the future. And a lot of those construction costs are associated with the east side of the Hudson. In fact, I believe you identified 1 million upstate customers. I would be very surprised if more than 100,000 of them are on the west side of the Hudson. I know New Windsor's approximately 25,000, the town of Newburgh's approximately 27,000. So I would imagine that if we, and I can put those numbers together, the final numbers, but on the west side of the Hudson, it's a very small percentage, yet we are put into the pool in terms of rate increases with a lot of facilities that don't really benefit us. And I don't want to be the one that's crying about the water customer at the bottom of the cul-de-sac, not wanting to pay for the loop for the rest of the cul-de-sac. But you know, when you've got a situation where the guy at the bottom of the hill is being asked to contribute to a Disney scale water park at the end of the, and I don't mean to be glib, I just mean in terms of scope and scale, the amount that's going on the east side of the Hudson really is way out of proportion to what's going on the west side of the Hudson in terms of cost. And I think that although maybe at one point in time, 110 years ago, it might have been appropriate to consider all of the upstate communities as presently constituted, that it may be time for the board to consider what I would term a west of Hudson rate, which would be far more equitable to the people on our side of the river in terms of fair cost sharing. I believe that that's something that the data probably exists in the Amawalk report now, and whether it's this year or maybe Amawalk next year could break it out. I think it would be at least interesting to see what a rate would be, a west of Hudson rate would be, which would more accurately reflect the services, especially the capital costs and services, which we receive over on the other side of the river. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is John Magito, the Chief Operator for the town of New Orleans.
I think I stole
You covered
John's
it,
thunder. I think unless he has something to add.
No, I don't think so.
Great, thank you. And our next registered speaker is Joel Dichter from the Dichter Law Firm.
Oh,
I have a written statement that I also delivered, had some comments to it. There were a few typos that I corrected in this one. If anybody has some extra copies without correcting typos. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Joel Dichter. I'm the law firm of Dichter Law and represent a number of Southern Westchester communities. I'm appearing before this New York City Water Board pretty much since its institution by the legislature. I don't even know what year that was anymore. A number of years ago. And coming up with a lot of issues related, as we just heard, over the rising costs of water over that time and the burden it's having on the upstate communities. Personally, I represent the village of Scarsdale, city of Yonkers, White Plains, Mount Vernon, towns Greenberg, United Water Westchester, newly named, which serves Rye Brook, Portchester, city and town of Rye, New Rochelle, and portions of Mamaroneck, Eastchester, Greenberg, Pelham, Pelham Manor, Tuckahoe, Dobbs Ferry, Ardsley, Hastings-on-Hudson, and Bronxville, as well as Westchester Joint Waterworks, which serves portions of the towns of Harrison, Mamaroneck, the village of Mamaroneck, and small portions of the cities of Rye and New Rochelle. So I will refer to these communities as the Upstate Coalition Upstate Communities. For 24 out of the last 25 years, the upstate communities have been subjected to substantial rate increases. The Upstate Rate Report for fiscal year 2016, prepared by Amawalk Consulting Group, shows an increase in the rate from going back to 1994, it was $165.23. By 2004, it was up to $542.36. And now for fiscal year 2016, it has jumped all the way to $1,728.99, another 9.87% increase, as Mr. Hillel said before. As for the so-called excess rate, unlike the entitlement rate that is established by the Water Board using a cost study, the excess rate is simply set equal to the in-city retail rate. This year, the proposed rate hits a milestone. The proposed excess rate breaks the $5,000 per million gallon barrier for the first time, coming in at $5,093.58. That is almost 3 times the proposed entitlement rate. At a recent meeting of the Water Board, it was stated that the excess rate promotes conservation and is similar to the rate design in use elsewhere. The excess rate goes way beyond any inverted rate design to promote conservation. In fact, the upstate communities are being penalized for conserving and experiencing declining usage each year. Let me explain by giving some historical context. The New York State Water Supply Act of 1905 and subsequent amendments granted New York City the authority to develop the Catskill and Delaware watershed systems. In exchange for the developmental rights, New York City is required to deliver water to municipalities and water districts located within 8 counties north of New York City in which the Catskill and Delaware watersheds are located. The 1905 Act also established entitlement amounts for each eligible municipality and water district for water to be withdrawn from the New York City system. The monthly entitlement is established each year based on the particular municipality's population, shown by the last census, multiplied by the daily per capita consumption within New York City. At the time the Water Supply Act was made law, the average per capita consumption was 125 gallons per day in the Bronx, for example. In comparison, in New Rochelle, it was only 30 million gallons a day, or 30 gallons per day. Thus, the legislature believed the entitlement formula would supply far in excess of actual needs. Since that time, even though the city population has increased to record levels, overall usage has declined sharply due to the loss of manufacturing in the city, changing demographics, and recently the universal metering and conservation programs put in place by the city. The city went from having no metering to now it being, I think, like 95% metered in the last 15 to 20 years. Similarly, for upstate communities, there has been both population growth and declining overall consumption. Since the upstate communities have long been metered and still have some manufacturing, upstate decline has not been as sharp within the city. Director Lowitz showed that in his presentation, that this in-city decline was 17% over the last 13 years, I think it was, and the upstate was 12%. So upstate is also declining. So what is the impact of all the above? It is that the entitlement quantities yielded by the formula are declining, even though upstate usage is declining at a faster pace in recent years. And I might add, even though the per capita use upstate is actually lower than it is within the city. But the impact of all this is, as entitlement quantities decline, the excess consumption amount goes up. This comes at a time when the entitlement excess rates are increasing annually. The overall impact is a cost of millions of dollars to upstate communities. Now the city is asking upstate communities to adopt additional conservation measures to reduce usage before the West Branch cutover. The non-intended impact of reduced consumption will be to increase the entitlement rate, as rising costs are divided by the smaller quantities of usage upstate. At the same time, more of the water will be reclassified as excess and charged at the higher, what we consider to be a penal rate, since it's not related to any cost, but just at the in-city retail rate, even though upstate communities supply their own distribution systems, do some of their own treatment, and they don't have any portion of those costs associated with in-city usage. Thus, the excess rate oddly acts as a penalty for conservation. Remember, too, that declining usage also means higher rates for the municipalities' internal distribution costs, because for their own costs have to be recovered from their customers. And as they have smaller quantities to divide it among, it means a higher rate for their own costs. As all the costs of water supply, including excess, are already included in the rate report prepared by Amawalk, there is no additional to the cost to the city from the supply of excess water. Nevertheless, the excess rate has increased from $2,000 in 2003 to over $5,000 proposed for this fiscal year. Meanwhile, the city of Yonkers, for example, has seen its entitlement quantity reduced by more than 1/3 in the last 20 years, and now experiences excess consumption charges of $2 to $3 million annually. The other communities also have declining entitlement and higher excess costs. I don't believe this was the intended result by the legislature, maybe not even by the water board or water authority, but that is what the reality is that we're facing today. It is time for the city to revisit how it calculates excess charges and the rate therefore. Upstate communities are already conserving and should not be penalized for doing so. Rather, the excess rate should recognize the reality and be adjusted to have a slightly inverted markup of, say, 20%, not 300%. This would be far more in keeping with water rate design in non-desert areas such as Arizona or California. If you're going to see large increases on the infra, it's generally in those areas where they have a lack of water supply. Fortunately, that is not our situation here. Now let me turn to the entitlement rate itself. Well, one more thing, and that is, to address this issue, we'd ask you to do something that's not been done before. And that is, when these hearings started for upstate communities, there always was one member of the water board that actually attended the presentation today. In the last few years, he has become a hearing officer, very helpful, very nice gentleman, happy to have him here. But it's not the same as being heard directly by someone from the water board. We would request that you convene a special meeting of the water board to address this issue of excess consumption and give us an opportunity to make a presentation to the full sitting board directly. Because if we can't resolve this issue among ourselves, we'll have to go back to the old days where we went to DEC, we have petition pending before the Public Service Commission, and necessarily go to the courts. That would not be our preference, but the burden of excess has become unbearable upon the upstate communities. It will only continue to get worse without some relief. Now let me move on to the entitlement rate. We agree that a cost-based rate is appropriate. However, as we forecast last year, the manner in which the city accounts for cash used for construction or defeasance of bonds has now become a real issue. I'm going to read a long quote from my statement from last year because it's applicable today and shows just what we were fearful of happening has happened. Quoting from last year. Nevertheless, we believe there are some steps that can be taken to limit increases without changing your determined level of cost of service by even $1. That centers on the rate-making treatment of cash used for either construction or defeasance of debt. For fiscal year 2013, the city included in its budget $150 million for cash used for these purposes. In fact, the city spent approximately $300 million during fiscal year 13, of which $45 million was allocated upstate. Consequently, the city is proposing to recoup that extra amount through the reconciliation of rate year estimates to actual expenditures. It's the largest reason for an additional cost added to fiscal year 15 rates of about $4 million. This year, we're talking about $40 million. Back to the statement. We also opposed the planned use of last year of $225 million in cash to finance construction and defeasance bonds. Now we understand the city projects spending $400 million during fiscal year 14, of which $60 million is for defeasance of debt allocated to upstate costs. And I'm sure we will see a future true-up for that amount as well. In fact, that's what we're seeing this year. And for next year, it's projected now to be $800 million, so we're going to even see double the problem next year. The use of cash at such levels to finance long-term construction projects flies in the face of accepted rate-making principles that have been in place since the time of the War Supply Act of 1905. The use of a large sum to finance construction results in the customers of today paying for the facilities used by the customers of tomorrow. In other words, water plants that have a useful life of 30 or even 50 years, by recovering 100% of the cost of those facilities in a single fiscal year, or 4 years as proposed this time, rates of customers for that fiscal year are saddled with the cost of providing water service long after many of them are no longer users of the system. If our recommendation had been adopted last year, in this case, the upstate rate increase would have been 8% instead of 12%. This past year was 5.1%, and it would have been lower. This year, it's going to be 9.8%, 7%, and in fact, it would be substantially lower if not for this specific issue. The board needs to recognize that even though it may operate on a cash basis for county, fair treatment of ratepayers means spreading costs across the useful life of facilities and across all those who benefit. The proposed rate should recognize that there are differences between accounting and rate-making treatments. Cash used for such purposes is to be spread over the life of the facilities or over the period of savings on the debt retired. Implementing those differences will reduce the rates and burdens on today's customers. So I said last year, and as a result, we have not taken that advice, we see it now a $43 million reconciliation this year, $44 million, which even you've recognized is too much of a burden on upstate communities, and have proposed to do it over 4 years, so it would be a $10 million hit to the cost of service for each of the next 4 years. We now have, looks like for fiscal year 15, we spent $805 million, of which I don't know if any was included in the budget. So that means next year we're going to be sitting here with double the problem we have this year. What are we going to do next year? What kind of increase for further burdens are they going to put on upstate customers? As noted, we gave you one solution last year, that the proper rate-making methodology is to spread the cost over the period of the savings. Here, I have not seen a report showing how those funds were used and what the period of savings are, of what bonds were retired, how long they would have been, what is the amount that's going to be saved by consumers from doing this. So I'm kind of working this out in the absence of knowing the specific facts related to that here. But I can tell you one thing. It's not going to be 4 years. It's most likely 20, 30, or 40 years that the savings will be realized from the defeasance of bonds in this case. Doing so results in if you spread it out to 30, 40 years, it will result in no loss to the city. It's just a question of a time period of recovery. As stated by the executive director of the New York City Water Finance Authority to the Water Board, the buyback program would lower future system rate increases through the purchase of high coupon debt structured to spread the debt service savings across future years. As the savings are spread across future years, so should the cost, and so should the burden on ratepayers and customers wholesale customers of the city. What the city does with its in-city customers is up to the city, but when it comes to your wholesale customers, you need to treat them fairly. The methodology adopted here is not treating the Upstate customers fairly. Secondly, the true-up method is designed to review actual out-of-pocket costs as compared to the forecast costs when rates were adopted due to factors beyond the city's control. That was the spirit of the agreement we reached in 2011, which made the annual true-up or reconciliation of the budgeted costs with actual costs, then an adjustment to future rates. Here it is not a question of interest rates being different than those forecast, or property taxes, or other matters such beyond the city's control, such as chemical costs based on the amount of usage. Rather, it's a discretionary use of more cash being available than anticipated. The true-up is not designed to enable the city to pass through additional costs when the city finds itself with an additional supply of cash on hand to spend. That is a bastardization of the true-up process. The excess funds could just have easily been used to reduce rates in the coming year, and in which case we'll be talking about a lower or no rate increase this year. Instead, that the funds are used to retire bonds early should not result in higher rates to customers. We've not even seen, as I said before, I haven't seen a study on the savings. Truly, when we entered into this agreement in 2011, which expires this year, this fiscal year, and so it was not, in fact, we looked at 2008 versus 2010. In 2008, 2010, there was no money spent for this purpose. We understand that there was a change in methodology that would take into account such items as the fees and such bonds, but not $800 million worth, or not for a rate-making treatment out of that would put such a burden on today's customers and rates when rates are already going up substantially. As I said, this is the last year of our stipulation. I think we need to sit down, revisit the issue, and see if we can come up with a way to modify or extend our agreement. Otherwise, we'll be returning back to New York State, whether it be DEC or the PSC, to review and set the entitlement and excess rates. We wish to avoid that process by working with the Water Board. Our question is, does the Water Board wish to work with us to come to an agreement, or does it want to just continue to adopt a rate report each year, set a rate in advance, and then adopt that rate regardless of what takes place today? We hope it will be the latter, and the former. We wish to sit down with us and try and work through these issues in recognition of the burdens placed on upstate communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, Joel, in response to your comments there, I mean, it is exactly your comments last year that encouraged us to spread this defeasance over 4 years, the impact of that this year. We have $30 billion of debt outstanding. That is a significant debt load. It is part of, best management practices to try to manage that debt load. And right now, rates have remained low, and we have had bonds that we can currently defease and pay off. This year, $805 million of defeasance that you mentioned, we have achieved $1.37 of savings for every dollar spent. Those debt service savings, 70% of the debt service savings will occur before 2021, which is 5 years off. So yes, it's spread over 5 years, the majority of it, but that's how we're spreading the cost over 4. That's a close mix, because we do a 4-year projection in the rate setting. So these changes were made based on what you asked for, and low interest rates on our debt do benefit upstate ratepayers just as they benefit in-city ratepayers, and that is our goal.
Thank you, and I appreciate that you took that into consideration. And My comment should not be that there's not an appropriate amount to use to defease bonds. The comment is how you treat the funds you've used. And I understand, for the first time I've heard that there will be savings over the 5 years, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those useful life of those facilities purchase of those bonds will be up in 4 or 5 years.
The goal there, though, is that we have a significant amount of debt outstanding. And yes, the facilities may be used over 30 years or longer, but a lot of utilities have some cash-based financing in their system. Otherwise, we actually would end up in a negative net asset position on our balance sheet, which we don't want. So it is with the goal of continuing to keep low interest rates and to be able to access the market that we do this defeasance, because there are capital projects out there yet to come.
Who gets the last word?
You can have it, you can say something else, I just wanted to respond to it.
The reason that you're able to do this, though, is because you have cash available. And you have cash available because it comes from one of two sources. It comes either from revenues and payments from customers, or it comes from other bond issuances. That makes a pool of cash available for you then to use to reduce the debt. In doing the true-up and reconciliation process, it wasn't intended, as I said, for you to be able to say, okay, we have more cash than we thought, or interest rates were lower than we projected, so now we have savings on our debt costs because the interest was lower than we projected, so that made the most pool of funds available. To then use that cash in a way that raises rates of current customers. That wasn't, if you want to use that cash that was available, that's become available, and use it to pay down bonds, that's great. But there shouldn't be necessarily a reconciliation of it. Before we had the true-up, there would not have been a reconciliation of it. There would not have been, you would have basically eaten that, because that is a discretionary amount used by the finance authority, I think, makes the first determination on this issue, and then by the water board. It wasn't our understanding of entering into this that would then impact the rates in the way it is.
Thank you. That was our last registered speaker. Is there anyone else in attendance that would like to speak?
If the board would permit me, what Joel said, his comments made me think of just one other thing that I would like to throw out for the board's consideration. Now, at least with regard to the excess rate, which at 5,000 per million, it's pretty pricey. At least for communities that are reducing their consumption, it's supposedly the goal of the excess rate. And in fact, New Windsor is, I believe, the only west of Hudson community that already has signed on with the agreement where we're going to be reducing our consumption farther. Perhaps if the board would at least consider some type of a tiered excess rate, especially since it's non-statutory, which would reflect the realities of what the consumptions are, especially in communities like New Windsor, which in other words, instead of just having one extremely high, borderline punitive excess rate, have some type of a tiering system for it, which would allow cooperative communities that are reducing their consumption, but not be paying just that one, very large jump up to a single excess rate.
Thank you, Mr. Willie.
Thank you. I'd like to-
Sure. If you could have your name, please.
Sure.
And your affiliation.
My name is Connie Fenden, manager of the Westchester Joint Waterworks. And, obviously, the comments of the Westchester Joint Waterworks are reflected in Joel's comments. But I'd like to add to that our own comments, and it has to do with the fact, the fact that for a number of years at this hearing and at meetings with DEP, we've asked that New York City, DEP, take the lead in dealing with the public, interacting with the public through the media, in promoting conservation. Public education, public information is essential in conservation measures. When the public, when our customers or anyone in the public gets a higher water bill, they just, pay, they know that the rates have gone up, and it's hard for them to see that it can go down somewhat, or at least remain the same, the rate of increase, decrease if they conserve water. I guess I need to express my disappointment in DEP, yet after all these years of making this comment, my not hearing anything on the radio or seeing it on TV or in the newspapers where New York City, region-wide, a village can't do its own public participation, public education effort. You expect the village of Pelham Manor or the village of Larchmont to have its own radio spots on CBS or ABC. That's something that should come from a higher reaching entity. And DEP is that entity. And I haven't seen it. Particularly disappointing is this year. With the water crisis in California and other parts of the country, this would have been an ideal summer for New York City to have its own campaign. It would make sense. The public is sensitized to the plight of the water problems in California, but yet they don't hear anything from New York City DEP. On the matter of providing assistance, we worked with DEP staff and its consultant on the demand management. The process is slow and cumbersome. We know you want to help, we know you have to go through certain procedures, but we've been on that almost a whole year already, and it takes a long time. It's very bureaucratic. I think it's a lot more effective if you have a more streamlined process for the demand management plans that we have embraced. And as you said, 6 of the communities have bought into it. It shouldn't take forever to wrap up these agreements and get the new meters installed, get the funding in place. So public education, radio spots, advertising, that best comes from you. And we ask you again, I don't know how many years I've made this comment, please do it, use some of our money that you're taking in the excess to design a really good regional program. You may be forced to do it anyway in 2 or 3 years. Sooner or later, we're going to have a drought. So you might as well make it an ongoing program. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? With no other speakers, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
You just lost me.